Washington, D.C., January 20th, 1993. Just before noon, George H.W. Bush steps out onto the north portico of the White House for the last time as president. Marine One waits on the lawn, blades already turning. 18 months earlier, this man commanded a 90% approval rating, the highest ever recorded for a sitting president, riding the wave of a war won in 100 hours. Today, he's leaving early, defeated, packing up a life that isn't his anymore. He pauses, just for a second, turns back toward the building behind him, the way people do when they know they won't see something again. Nobody in the crowd notices. The car is waiting. The country has already moved on. But here's what almost no one talks about. Losing the presidency doesn't end a man's story. It just changes what kind of story it becomes. Some men vanish, some men get destroyed, and one, unbelievably, gets to come back and do it all over again. This is what defeat actually costs an American president, and it is rarely what you'd expect. John Quincy Adams was already a name that meant something before he ever set foot in the Oval Office. The son of the second president, a diplomat since he was a teenager, Secretary of State under Monroe. By the time he won the presidency in 1824, he'd already spent his whole life in rooms where history was being written. But winning that election was messy. He lost the popular vote and the electoral count to Andrew Jackson, and only became president after the House of Representatives handed him the job. Jackson's supporters called it a stolen election before Adams even took the oath. 4 years later, they made sure he'd never forget it. The 1828 rematch was one of the ugliest campaigns in American history. Jackson's camp accused Adams of corruption and elitism. Adams's camp accused Jackson of adultery and murder. When the votes came in, it wasn't close. Jackson crushed him. Adams became only the second president in the young republic's history to lose a bid for a second term, and he left Washington the way most defeated men do, quietly, expecting to fade into private life and be remembered, if at all, as a footnote between two more famous names. That's not what happened. 2 years later, in 1830, the citizens of his home district in Massachusetts asked him to run for a seat in the House of Representatives. A former president, taking a job most men would consider a demotion. Adams said yes. Friends reportedly warned him it would look strange, as if he were stepping down a ladder he'd already climbed. Adams didn't care. He served in the House for the next 17 years and became one of the most relentless anti-slavery voices in Congress, fighting for the right to even discuss the issue on the House floor when Southern lawmakers tried to ban it outright. He never stopped working. On February 21, 1848, at 70 years old, Adams collapsed at his desk on the House floor, struck by a massive stroke in the middle of a vote. Colleagues carried him to a nearby room inside the Capitol. He never went home again. 2 days later, he died there, inside the building where he'd spent almost 2 decades refusing to disappear. Losing the presidency for John Quincy Adams wasn't the end of his public life. It was barely the middle of it. He is the only man in American history to leave the presidency and then build a second career more consequential than the first, and he did it without ever holding higher office again. Keep that in mind because not every defeated president gets a second act. The next man on this list tried to get one too, and America wasn't nearly as forgiving the second time around. Martin Van Buren didn't just hold the presidency, he built the machine that got people elected to it. Before he ever ran for the office himself, he was the architect behind the modern Democratic Party, a master of coalition building and a backroom strategy, so effective his rivals nicknamed him the Little Magician. He engineered Andrew Jackson's rise to power, served as his vice president, and in 1836 rode that same machine straight into the White House as Jackson's hand-picked successor. Then the machine broke down, and it wasn't his fault exactly. Just weeks after Van Buren took office, the Panic of 1837 hit. Banks collapsed. Unemployment soared. Cotton prices crashed. It was one of the worst economic depressions the young country had ever seen, triggered largely by financial policies set in motion during Jackson's final years. But Van Buren was the one sitting in the chair when it happened, and voters don't usually care whose fault a crisis actually is. They care who's in charge when it lands. By 1840, the country was ready to punish somebody, and Van Buren was the only name on the ballot. His opponent, William Henry Harrison, ran one of the first true image campaigns in American politics, portraying himself as a humble frontier war hero while painting Van Buren as an out-of-touch aristocrat who dined on gold plates in the White House while ordinary Americans starved. It wasn't entirely true. It worked anyway. Van Buren lost in a landslide. Most men would have taken the loss and walked away. Van Buren didn't. In 1844, he tried to reclaim the Democratic nomination and lost the party fight to James Polk. Then, in 1848, still not done, he ran for president a third time, this time as the candidate of the Free Soil Party, a new anti-slavery movement built partly out of his own frustration with the party he'd helped create. He didn't win a single state. He didn't even come close. Here's the twist that makes Van Buren's story sting more than most. The man who invented the modern American political party, who wrote the playbook for how coalitions win national elections, spent the last 2 decades of his political life watching that exact playbook get used against him again and again by men who learned it from watching him do it first. He died in 1862, largely out of public relevance, remembered less for anything he accomplished as president and more for what he built before he ever got there. The architect of the system, ultimately dismantled by the system itself. Keep that pattern in mind. A man punished not for what he did wrong, but for simply being in the room when the economy turned on him. Because the next president on this list didn't even get that much time. His defeat came with a grief no campaign strategy could have prepared him for. Benjamin Harrison entered the White House in 1889 as a war hero's grandson, living up to a famous name. His grandfather, William Henry Harrison, had been president too, though he died just a month into office back in 1841. Benjamin built his own legacy instead of leaning on the family one. A former Civil War general, a respected senator from Indiana, a man known for his sharp legal mind and a personality so formal that even his own supporters joked he could make a friendly handshake feel like a business transaction. He won the presidency in 1888 in a strange, uniquely American way. Grover Cleveland, the sitting president, actually won more total votes nationwide, but Harrison won the Electoral College. And that was enough. 4 years later, in 1892, the two men squared off again in a rare presidential rematch. And this time, Harrison wasn't just fighting Cleveland. He was fighting for his life at home. His wife, Caroline, had fallen seriously ill with tuberculosis earlier that year, and by the fall, it was clear she wasn't going to recover. Harrison made a decision almost no politician in his position would make today. He stopped campaigning almost entirely. He stayed by her side in the White House while the election played out without him. Caroline Harrison died on October 25, 1892, just 13 days before the country went to the polls. The nation, out of respect, largely paused its usual campaign attacks in the final stretch, but the damage to Harrison's chances was already done. He'd barely appeared in public for months, his opponent had kept campaigning, and grief doesn't win elections. On November 8th, Grover Cleveland beat him decisively, reclaiming the presidency he'd lost 4 years earlier. Here's the twist. Harrison didn't rage against the loss, didn't blame the timing, didn't try to spin the tragedy into sympathy. He simply left Washington and went home to Indianapolis, returned to practicing law, and eventually remarried in 1896, quietly rebuilding a private life out of the ashes of a very public one. He never sought office again. He spent his final years writing, arguing occasional cases before the Supreme Court, and largely staying out of the political fights he once dominated. He died in 1901, remembered less for policy than for the singular grace with which he absorbed one of the cruelest 1-2 punches in presidential history. But pay attention to the name that just beat him, Cleveland. Because before this video is over, you're going to meet him twice. And the second time, his story is going to break every rule this list has followed so far. William Howard Taft never really wanted to be president. What he wanted, more than anything, was to sit on the Supreme Court, a dream he'd held since law school. Instead, his close friend and political patron Theodore Roosevelt pushed him toward the White House in 1908, personally handpicking him as his successor. Taft won easily. He was smart, capable, a skilled administrator, and almost immediately, deeply miserable in the job he'd been talked into taking. The trouble started with Roosevelt himself. After leaving office, Roosevelt expected Taft to continue his aggressive progressive agenda, trust-busting, conservation, sweeping reform. Taft, more cautious and legally minded by nature, governed differently, and the two old friends drifted into open political warfare. By 1912, Roosevelt was so furious with his former protege that he did something unprecedented. He challenged a sitting president of his own party, launching a third-party run under the newly formed Progressive Bull Moose Party rather than let Taft keep the nomination uncontested. The Republican vote split right down the middle. Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic challenger, watched the two Republicans tear each other apart and walked through the middle of the wreckage. When the results came in, Taft didn't just lose, he suffered the worst defeat ever recorded for a sitting American president seeking re-election. He carried only 2 states. He finished in 3rd place, behind both Wilson and his own former mentor, Roosevelt. A sitting president, beaten into irrelevance by a man he used to call a friend. Here's where Taft's story turns into something almost nobody expects. In 1921, nearly a decade after the most humiliating defeat in presidential history, President Warren Harding appointed him Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The seat Taft had wanted his entire adult life, the one he'd never really wanted to trade away for the presidency in the first place. He served on the bench for nearly 9 years and later admitted on the record that he considered his time as Chief Justice more rewarding than his time as president. He is the only person in American history to hold both offices, and by his own account, he only ever truly loved one of them. Keep that idea with you. A man who lost the job everyone else wanted and finally got the one he did. Because the next president on this list wasn't chasing up on a dream job after his defeat. He was fighting to be remembered as anything other than the man who pardoned the scandal that broke the country's trust. Gerald Ford never ran for president or vice president to get where he ended up. A fact almost unheard of in American history. A longtime Republican congressman from Michigan, Ford was appointed vice president in 1973 under the 25th Amendment after Spiro Agnew resigned in disgrace over a bribery scandal. Then, in August 1974, Richard Nixon resigned rather than face impeachment over Watergate, and Ford was sworn in as president without a single American having cast a vote for him in that role. He remains the only person in U.S. history to hold the office without ever winning a national election for president or vice president. Ford tried to steady a country that felt betrayed by its own government. And then, just 1 month into office, he made the decision that would define and doom his presidency. On September 8, 1974, Ford granted Richard Nixon a full and unconditional pardon for any crimes he may have committed as president, closing the door on potential prosecution before charges were ever filed. Ford said it was necessary to let the country heal and move past Watergate. Many Americans heard something else entirely, a backroom deal, a cover-up finished quietly by the man who inherited the mess. His approval ratings collapsed almost overnight, dropping more than 20 points in a matter of days. Whispers of a secret arrangement with Nixon followed him for the rest of his term, despite Ford testifying before Congress under oath that no such deal existed. He spent the next 2 years trying to outrun a decision he couldn't take back, battling inflation, a bruising primary challenge from Ronald Reagan within his own party, and a country still not ready to trust anyone connected to the previous administration. In November 1976, Ford lost to Jimmy Carter, narrowly, by less than 2 percentage points nationally, one of the closest elections of the 20th century. He'd served just under 2.5 years, never having been elected to the office at all, and now he wouldn't get the chance to be. Here's the twist that took decades to unfold. History was far kinder to Ford than 1976 America had been. In the years after leaving office, Ford was increasingly recognized, across party lines, for the pardon's actual outcome, a country that avoided a drawn-out criminal trial of a former president and could focus on rebuilding trust in its institutions instead. In 2001, he received the Profile and Courage Award from the John F. Kennedy Library, presented in part by Senator Ted Kennedy himself, a Democrat, who publicly said he'd once opposed the pardon but had come to believe Ford made the right call. Ford lived until 2006, becoming one of the longest-lived presidents in American history and one of the most respected elder statesmen in Washington of either party. Keep Carter's name in mind, the man who beat Ford in 1976. Because his story on this list is about to take you somewhere far more complicated than a pardon. The next defeat didn't happen a generation ago. It's still unfolding right now. Donald Trump's defeat in November 2020 didn't look like any other loss on this list. He wasn't a quiet former general or a career diplomat easing into retirement. He was a sitting president who spent weeks publicly disputing the outcome, and the fallout from that period would follow him longer and harder than any electoral defeat in modern American history. The 2020 election happened in the middle of a pandemic that had already killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, with record numbers of mail-in ballots reshaping how the country voted. Trump lost to Joe Biden, and rather than concede in the traditional sense, he and his legal team filed dozens of lawsuits challenging results in multiple states, nearly all of which were dismissed by courts, including judges he himself had appointed. On January 20th, 2021, he became the first outgoing president in over a century and a half to skip his successor's inauguration entirely. What followed was unprecedented for any American president, sitting or former. Trump was indicted in 4 separate criminal cases between 2023 and 2024, 2 federal, 2 state, covering allegations ranging from mishandling classified documents after leaving office to attempts to overturn the 2020 election results, to falsifying business records in New York to cover up a hush money payment before the 2016 election. In May 2024, a New York jury convicted him on all 34 felony counts in that hush money case, making him the first former U.S. president ever convicted of a crime. He was separately found liable, not criminally guilty, but liable in civil court, for sexual abuse and defamation in a case brought by writer E. Jean Carroll, resulting in tens of millions of dollars in damages. Then came the twist nobody else on this list can claim. In November 2024, Trump won the presidential election, defeating Vice President Kamala Harris and returning to the White House. Under long-standing Justice Department policy that a sitting president cannot be federally prosecuted, both federal cases against him were formally dismissed before he took office, not because the charges were disproven, but because the policy simply doesn't allow the prosecution to continue. Prosecutors in Georgia later dropped that state's election interference case as well. Only the New York conviction stands today, upheld but resulting in what's called an unconditional discharge. No prison, no fine, no probation, and still working through appeals. The civil judgments against him remain active and are also under appeal. Here's what makes Trump's chapter different from every story you've heard so far tonight. Every other defeated president on this list built a second act somewhere else: Congress, the courtroom, the charity circuit, private life. Trump's second act was the presidency itself, all over again. Keep that in mind because it raises a question this list hasn't asked yet. What happens when defeat doesn't actually stick? The next president never got the chance to find out. His fall from grace came fast, and it came almost entirely from a word: Hoover. Herbert Hoover walked into the presidency in 1929 as one of the most respected men in America, a self-made mining engineer turned humanitarian, famous for organizing massive food relief efforts that saved millions of lives across Europe during and after World War I. He wasn't a career politician. He was, by nearly every account of the time, exactly the kind of competent, no-nonsense manager the country wanted running things. He won the 1928 election in a landslide. Then, 7 months into his presidency, the stock market collapsed. October 1929. The crash triggered what would become the Great Depression, the worst economic catastrophe in American history. Unemployment eventually climbing past 25%, banks failing by the thousands, families losing homes and farms across the entire country. Hoover did respond, authorizing public works projects and urging businesses not to cut wages, but his instincts leaned toward limited government intervention and voluntary cooperation at a moment the country desperately needed something bigger. It wasn't enough, and it wasn't fast enough. The country's anger found a symbol, and that symbol was his name. Shantytowns of homeless families sleeping under newspapers sprang up in cities across America, and people started calling them Hoovervilles. Empty pockets turned inside out were Hoover flags. Newspapers used as blankets on park benches were Hoover blankets. It didn't matter that the crash had roots in policies and speculation that predated his presidency by years. The public needed someone to blame, and Hoover was the man standing at the podium when it all came apart. By 1932, running against New York Governor Franklin Roosevelt, Hoover didn't stand a chance. Roosevelt promised a New Deal and swept the election in a landslide reversal of Hoover's own victory 4 years earlier. Hoover left office as one of the most unpopular presidents in American history, and for over a decade afterward, he was treated as something close to a national villain. Rarely invited to speak, largely written out of Republican Party events, his name still a punchline. Here's the twist almost nobody remembers. In 1946, a Democrat brought him back. President Harry Truman, needing someone with real experience organizing mass food relief, asked Hoover, then in his 70s, 17 years removed from office, to help coordinate global famine relief in the aftermath of World War II. Hoover accepted, traveled to nearly 40 countries, and helped save millions of lives a second time. Decades after his first humanitarian mission had made him famous, Truman later appointed him to lead a major government reorganization commission as well. The two men, from opposing parties, developed a genuine mutual respect. By the time Hoover died in 1964, at 90 years old, much of the public venom had faded, replaced by a more complicated, more accurate picture of a man who'd been right about very little as president and right about almost everything before and after it. Keep Truman's name in mind, a rival party rebuilding a broken reputation instead of burying it, because the next chapter closes the loop this whole video opened with. It's time to go back to that man on the White House steps. George H.W. Bush arrived at the presidency in 1989 with a resume almost no other candidate could match. Decorated Navy pilot in World War II, ambassador to the United Nations, envoy to China, director of the CIA, and 8 years as Ronald Reagan's vice president. He was, by design and by temperament, the ultimate insider, a steady hand meant to consolidate the Reagan era rather than reinvent it. And for a while, it worked better than almost anyone expected. In January 1991, Bush led a coalition of nations into the Gulf War, driving Iraqi forces out of Kuwait in a fast, decisive military campaign that lasted just over a month. The victory was overwhelming, and so was the reaction back home. Bush's approval rating soared to roughly 90%, the highest ever recorded for a sitting American president, and by some measures, a number no president before or since has matched. Political analysts at the time openly speculated that his re-election in 1992 wasn't just likely, it was inevitable. 18 months later, none of that mattered. A recession had settled over the country, unemployment was climbing, and Bush, the man who just orchestrated one of the most successful military operations in modern history, appeared disconnected from the everyday economic anxiety gripping American households. His own campaign struggled to articulate a clear domestic vision. Meanwhile, a young, energetic governor from Arkansas named Bill Clinton built his entire campaign around a single internal slogan that would later become famous: "It's the economy, stupid." A third-party spoiler, businessman Ross Perot siphoned off nearly 19% of the popular vote, further fracturing Bush's path back to victory. On November 3, 1992, Clinton won decisively. The most popular president in modern American history, at 90% approval less than 2 years earlier, had just been voted out of office. It remains one of the fastest and most dramatic reversals of political fortune in the country's history, a reminder that no approval number, however historic, guarantees anything once an economy sours. Here's the twist that nobody watching that election night could have predicted. In the weeks before leaving office, Bush did something almost unheard of between rivals. He wrote Clinton, the man who had just ended his presidency, a warm, gracious letter, wishing him well and offering quiet support for whatever lay ahead. It was the beginning of an improbable friendship. Over the following 2 decades, the two men golfed together, traveled together, and worked side by side raising disaster relief funds after the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami and Hurricane Katrina in 2005. Clinton later said, "Bush became like a second father to him." When Bush passed away in 2018, Clinton was one of the people who spoke at his funeral. Keep that image with you, a defeated president choosing grace over grievance, turning an election night loss into one of the most genuine friendships in modern political history. Because the next president on this list made a similar choice after his own defeat, just in a very different direction, not toward the man who beat him, but toward the rest of the world. Jimmy Carter entered the presidency in 1976 as a Washington outsider, a former Georgia governor and peanut farmer who promised the country he would never lie to them, a direct answer to the exhaustion and distrust left behind by Watergate. For a moment, it worked. He negotiated the Camp David Accords in 1978, brokering a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt that still holds today, one of the most significant diplomatic achievements of the entire 20th century. But domestically, his presidency came apart under pressure. The country had never quite faced before. Inflation climbed into double digits. Gas lines stretched around city blocks during an energy crisis. And on November 4, 1979, militants in Iran stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 Americans hostage. The crisis dragged on for 444 days, playing out on the nightly news in a way that made Carter look increasingly powerless. A failed military rescue attempt in April 1980 ended in a helicopter crash in the Iranian desert, killing 8 American servicemen and deepening the sense that his administration simply couldn't get a handle on the moment. By Election Day, the country had made up its mind. Ronald Reagan crushed Carter in November 1980, winning 44 states to Carter's 6. In one of the strange coincidences of American history, the hostages were finally released on January 20, 1981, the exact day Carter left office, as if the crisis itself had been waiting for a new president before letting go. Carter left Washington widely regarded as one of the weakest presidents of the modern era, a one-term footnote overshadowed by inflation, gas lines, and a hostage crisis he never solved. Here's where his story becomes unlike anything else on this list. Rather than fade into the private life most defeated presidents choose, Carter built an entirely new career out of his loss. He founded the Carter Center in 1982, dedicating himself to global health initiatives, election monitoring in fragile democracies, and conflict resolution efforts around the world. He picked up a hammer and became one of the most recognizable faces of Habitat for Humanity, personally building homes for low-income families well into his 90s. In 2002, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, not for anything he did as president, but explicitly for his decades of work afterward. He lived to 100 years old, longer than any president in American history, and by the time he died in December 2024, historians across the political spectrum had come to agree on something remarkable. Jimmy Carter's post-presidency was by almost any measure more impactful than his presidency itself. Keep that idea close, because it's about to be tested by the strangest story on this entire list. Every man you've heard about tonight lost and stayed lost. The next one didn't play by that rule at all. Grover Cleveland's name has already come up twice tonight, and for good reason. In 1888, he was the sitting president, a Democrat known for his blunt honesty and his willingness to veto bills he considered wasteful, even when they were politically popular. He ran for re-election against Benjamin Harrison, the man you met back in Chapter 3, and actually won more total votes nationwide than his opponent. It didn't matter. Harrison won the Electoral College, and under the rules that have governed American elections since the beginning, that was the only number that counted. Cleveland packed up and left the White House, seemingly just another name to add to the list of one-term presidents undone by the system. He didn't disappear. Cleveland spent the next 4 years practicing law in New York, staying visible within Democratic Party circles, and watching as Harrison's presidency ran into exactly the kind of economic trouble that tends to sink incumbents. By 1892, the same two men squared off for a third consecutive presidential election, a rematch nobody had seen before and nobody has seen since. This time, the outcome flipped completely. Cleveland won decisively, reclaiming both the popular vote and the Electoral College, and walked back into the White House he'd been forced to leave 4 years earlier. No one before him had ever done it. No one since has done it either. Grover Cleveland remains the only person in American history to serve 2 terms as president that weren't back-to-back, which is exactly why, to this day, he's counted twice in the official numbering of presidents. He's both the 22nd president and the 24th, the same man occupying 2 different chapters in the same history book. Here's the twist that undoes everything this list has told you so far. Every man in this video accepted his defeat as final. Adams built a second act in Congress. Van Buren tried and failed to return. Taft found peace on the Supreme Court instead. Hoover waited 17 years just to be trusted again. Carter never even tried to get the job back. Cleveland is the only one who looked at the American electorate, got told no, and simply refused to accept that the answer was permanent. And 4 years later, the same voters who fired him hired him back. Which raises the real question. This entire list has been circling around from the very first chapter. Is a lost election really the end of the story? Or is it just the part of the story America likes to remember least? For 9 of the 10 men on this list, defeat became a redirection, a different kind of legacy, built somewhere else. For one man, it was never the end at all. It was just intermission.